Third point is that this stalemate has also helped the regime sustain its core support, not just amongst its Alawi minority, but also from Christians, Druze, and even Sunnis, what we call the soft pillars of support of the regime, particularly those who look at the opposition and cry out, "Man al-Badil," who is the alternative? And this is very significant. Instead of thinking, what is the alternative? Ma huwa al-Badil. They're still thinking in terms of man al-Badil. And, these two, the fact that you have a disunited opposition, the fact that militarily we have no breakthrough, have really maintained this stalemate. Now, we have some changes coming up, starting with the Doha meetings that just occurred last week. We start to see this as maybe a shift, maybe a breaking ground here in terms of unifying the opposition. But, it's still too early to say. The entity that has been created, the coalition, is very, very fragile. It is headed by inexperienced individuals, and the potential for repeating the mistakes of the SNC loom all too great. Now, if just briefly tell you a little bit about the effects of the stalemate. As a result of this stalemate, both political and military, the regime still feels reasonably strong and in control despite its serious losses. The opposition, as I just mentioned, does not have the organization and the military capabilities to make a shift in its favor. So there is, in many ways, there's little room for maneuver here. So what needs to happen now is we need to see some game changers. For me, the principal game changer will need to be the ability of the opposition to start to take down major cities. And for this to happen, you need to start to introduce what I would call qualitative weapons. This is the type of weaponry that would be able to neutralize initially the Air Force, that is the air power that is hitting them, and then later on they will need to have something to take out the very heavy main-line battle tanks that are still to be fully used against them. If such a game changer is introduced, and all indications are that we may start to see this very soon, then Aleppo is ripe to fall. That would be the first domino. And speaking of dominoes, Aleppo is very critical because Aleppo is the anchor. It is the anchor that holds Deir ez-Zor. If you know your Syria map, you would know that Deir ez-Zor is to the south, and it controls what we call the Badie, the desert area. If Deir ez-Zor goes, Deir is important because it controls the road, what we call the Tariq al-Badie, that takes you to Palmyra, and from Palmyra into Damascus. Damascus will not fall from the north. Hama-Homs road, if you're thinking of Aleppo falling and then you drive down through Homs and Hama straight to Damascus, that cannot happen. Homs and Hama are too well defended. It's the heartland of, it's too close to the heartland of the regime. It's very difficult. It won't come from the south. It won't come from Deraa, because the Jordanians don't really want to open another front. And we all know what's happening in Jordan in the last few days. And so that's even more reason for the Jordanians to not allow for a major front to open up on their on that front. The west, you have Lebanon and Hezbollah. That's not going to happen, which only leaves the east, the East Ghouta, and basically that means the Tariq al-Badie, the desert road that will run from Deir ez-Zor through Palmyra and into Damascus. The regime fully understands this. They understand the implications of such an event. So if Aleppo and Deir ez-Zor fall, as I would expect them to fall sometime between now and Christmas, if we have that qualitative input in terms of equipment, then the regime may find itself finally in a situation where it needs to negotiate. Until now, the regime, in its own mindset, does not feel that it needs to negotiate because it has not suffered any major losses, i.e. the cities. But if the cities start to fall, then that might just begin to get them to think that I need to do something a little more. Also, it might also bring the Russians to the table, because the Russians will now be looking at the situation. They'll be seeing a different map, and that might also bring the Russians to the table too. So we may start to see such a shift. Negotiations also require an opposition partner that is able to negotiate, hence this current haste to create a unified opposition with a government in exile. So this is all about checking boxes. If I think of the boxes, elections in the US, check, done. Opposition united, check, done. Military sort of united, we have these regional commands now, check, done. Introduce some qualitative material, the domino effect begins, check. And then you come to the next point, which is the real meat on the ground, and that's the negotiation. You need to bring the Syrian regime to a negotiating stance, which up till now the opposition has not really been able, and neither has the international community for that matter, been able to bring them to. Finally, if I come to the Gulf states and the role of the Gulf states, particularly Qatar and Turkey, who've been working very closely to unify this opposition, that's where I think the role of the Gulf has been. And they've really focused, they've invested most of their effort into the actual political opposition and to unify them. And so the new coalition that has just emerged is very much a Qatari, Turkish sort of inspiration, if I may call it. But we have other players in the Gulf too. We have the Saudis. And I can tell you from the news that I've heard that the Saudis are not very happy. This new coalition basically is not something that the Saudis are very happy with, particularly because the Saudis went the other route and invested in the military side. I know that that's where the Saudis put all their effort in. And so you also have, I think, these two competing routes. Do you push militarily and hope that you can eventually insert enough military force on the ground to topple the regime militarily? Or do you go the political route? Do you create a unified opposition with enough military clout behind it to start the domino effect falling, to bring the regime back to the negotiating table, which until now has not happened? And I think I can...
You can have one more minute.
I can have one more minute. Wow.
What happens between now? Is Assad still in power in a year?
Well, I think that if I was to look at it my way, I think we're going to see a 2-year civil war. I know people in Washington don't like to hear civil wars, but that's essentially what we're going to see. We're going to see a 2-year civil war with with a protracted stalemate, followed by a tie-of-like agreement, followed by a compromise, followed by, the Assads are going to be out, it's for sure. I don't think the Assad regime itself will survive, but the rest of without the Assads, they'll figure something out. I think that would be my assessment.
Ahmed Azam, thank you very much for your insights. And now from just across the border, but right next to Ahmed on the table, we'll hear from Shaban Kardas from TOBB University in Ankara.
Thanks a lot. I was asked to talk about 3 different questions. The first one is Turkey's approach to the Syrian conflict. The second one is the implications of the case for Turkish foreign policy, and lastly, the implications of the Syrian crisis for Turkey's domestic politics. For each, I need at least 15 minutes, but I will try to do my best to give you my opinions on those 3 in 13 minutes. On the first question, how Turkey approached the Syrian crisis, what was the reading the Turkish government especially had when it approached the Syrian crisis? I guess we first try to understand Turkey's overall approach to the Arab Spring, because as far as I can tell, the way the Turkish government contextualized, the way it framed its approach to Syria was very much in line with its general reading of the developments in the Middle East in the last 2 years or so. So in that sense, the Turkish government's overall view was that what was happening in the Middle East was a demand, a bottom-up demand for change, transformation in the region. So in that sense, it was a demand, genuine demand of the ordinary Arab people, and it deserved Turkey's support. So in that sense, you see a very positive identification of the Turkish government with the masses on the streets, because in a sense, when you read closely the discourse of the government governing party, they also see themselves in the process of transformation. So in this sense, the historic trajectory of the Middle Eastern people in the context of the Arab Spring was very much related to the transformation, the broader transformation that was taking place in Turkish domestic politics as well. So in that sense, from the very beginning on, Turkey did a position which was supportive of the people. In Tunisia, there was not much room for Turkey to take a position. We know the developments. It led to a rather peaceful regime change, and the critical case for Turkey was the situation in Egypt. As we know, there were several days of demonstrations. Prime Minister Erdogan was the first Middle Eastern leader to call on Mubarak to leave power. That was a very critical moment. In that sense, it also created a sort of precedent in the upcoming confrontation between the regimes and the people. If you take side with the people, there are gains, because whoever comes to power after the regime change will be the new rulers. So if you could act early on, take a very proactive position, then you could also wave the future. In that sense, there was this precedent, which I would argue affected the way Turkey approached the Syrian crisis as well. So in Syria as well, since the very beginning of the demonstrations in Dera in the south, Turkey developed a critical reading. But in both Syria and Libya, in both cases, Turkey was in a more difficult position. Previously, Turkey's relation with Mubarak was not as good, but with both Syria and Libya, Turkey at the elite level, at the regime level, developed good relations. So in that sense, breaking up with the regime in Syria and Libya was not as easy. So in that sense, for a while, Turkey pursued a policy of engagement, tried to, as you suggested in the introduction, tried to mediate between the regime and the opposition forces. This policy continued, as far as I can tell, at least until the August of 2011. It was in Ramadan, and Turkish foreign minister also visited Damascus, spent several hours trying to convince Assad to introduce reforms. And after that event, as far as I remember, Assad withdrew tanks from some cities, but even the Turkish ambassador in Damascus visited that town, and a few days later, still the bombing started. This was the moment where Turkey, I would say, lost the hope on Assad's ability to deliver reforms, and after that point on, we see that Turkey increasingly, gradually started to give up on Assad, tried to increase its support to the opposition, but the relationship between Turkey and the opposition started much earlier on. Even in the first half of 2011, Turkey allowed the opposition to hold meetings on its territory in Istanbul, in Antalya, early on in March, April 2011. There were several meetings of the opposition groups. After August 2011, Turkey increasingly started to coordinate its policies with the Gulf countries. As we know, especially the Qatar initiative still ongoing, but the Arab League plan, Turkey was very much supportive of it. Also the UN process, the two resolutions. Faced with the persistent power of the regime, Turkey later tried to reach out to Tehran and Moscow. This was also very important. Turkey was trying to undercut the support of the Syrian regime in international platforms. As far as I could recall, in February 2012, Turkish foreign minister visited Tehran. He also visited Moscow. Those meetings were critical, as far as I can tell. He figured out that those two backers of the regime would not give up on Assad. So after that period, Turkey increasingly coordinated its policies with the West, especially the United States. Since then, we see some policy coordination between Turkey and the United States, but that coordination has also very problematic dimensions. We see reports that Turkey is not satisfied with the level and degree of U.S. involvement. This was part of your question as well, which we can discuss later during the Q&A session.